This Lansing Voice belongs to Bill Castanier, seen here at the Antiquarian Book and Paper Show in Lansing. Bill blogs as mittenlit.com, and no one knows more about the book industry.
I got started with books like everyone does as a child, reading things like Piggly Wiggly, The Adventures of Benjamin Bunny, and I got my first library card when I was about 6 at a Carnegie Library in Bay City, and we'd go every week, and I'd take home many books, and by the time I was 7, I needed a part-time job to pay for my library fines. I wasn't very good at returning books. I think that may be typical for most people, or their parents read. My parents weren't great readers. My grandmother was a very good reader, and she read this, I know this sounds strange, but Reader's Digest condensed. So she got them every month, or however often they came, and very young I started reading those. And yeah, as everyone knows, they're short synopsises, basically, of a book. Then, during the Michigan Sesquicentennial, which was one of the jobs I held in state government, I got very much interested in Michigan authors and their connection to the state. And about 20-some years later, when I retired out of state government, I started a website called mittenlit.com. It's a blog, and it is only on Michigan authors and other authors touring in Michigan. It's sort of the news about the industry in Michigan. And I've done that almost 2.5 years. I've over 1,000 blogs. It's been a lot of fun. It's created a lot of connections for me. Before then, I started working for Lansing City Pulse doing literary reviews. And I've interviewed close to 500 authors now, and probably during a 25-year period, I've gone to probably 1,000 book signings. So it's something I'm incredibly passionate about. I'm also on the Carytown Book Festival organizing committee in Ann Arbor. I've been on the Great Michigan Read Selection, the Michigan Notable Books I'm on currently. And I try not to do much that doesn't have to do with books or authors. I do have an expertise in Michigan authors. I do a presentation on 150 Michigan authors from history. I'm also working on an online-only book on the tour of Michigan authors, the 150 Michigan authors. One time I thought I wanted to do that as a book. I don't. I want to do it online, basically give it away or charge next to nothing. First one would have to be Amazon, the creation of Amazon in 1995. I've got a favorite New Yorker cover that shows a bookstore on one half of it, and right next to that is a woman accepting a package from Amazon. I mean, it's the classic sort of split in the industry. And one of the things that Amazon did for the first time, it created a catalog where you can look up any book virtually. And it also created a backlist. So you could sell books that had been out of print forever on there. And then there's tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people selling books now online through Amazon. You can get pretty much whatever you want. One of the things it did is, first it gave you access to almost any book ever printed, but it also leveled the price out. For the first time, the prices started to come down in books rather than keeping going up, especially used books. Amazon also became sort of the big elephant that started the destruction of local bookstores. They were selling books at nearly half price of what a book would be sold in a new bookstore. So they became very problematic very quickly. And why is Amazon popular? I'd say one of the things is price and 2-day service. They have a program of Prime Savers or Prime Amazon account. You pay $79 a year, which they've maintained for a number of years. You get a book in 2 days. So it leads to spontaneous purchases. I mean, you click and you're there. And a lot of people do that. I think the second thing was the rise of chain bookstores. That sort of led to in many ways, it led to the destruction of a book industry because there were many, many independents across the country, thousands of them. Now, in the last few years alone, 700 of those have closed. And that's due to Amazon and the rise of chain bookstores. Now, what's interesting about chain bookstores is they really started in Michigan. Borders was in Ann Arbor. They were founded in 1971 as a small bookstore. It wasn't until almost 12 years later that they began what is called a superstore. And by the time they were basically dissolved and sold off last year, they had 1,300 chain bookstores. Barnes & Noble has about 1,300. Well, what they started to do to the industry as a whole is they controlled it. So they would price books in a pirate manner. Bestsellers were always 30 to 40% off. And that really took a lot of independents out of business. They could not compete anymore. And by the end of probably last year, there's probably fewer than 1,000 solid independents in the country. There just aren't that many that sell new bookstores or new books. One of the things that came out of that, though, interesting here in the Lansing area, is Schuler's. The two owners of Schuler's, Cecile and Bill Faisenfeld, are former employees of Borders. They were one of the first employees of Borders. They actually started what would be now considered the first superstore in Grand Rapids before Borders did. Borders was known because they had a technologically advanced ordering systems for books. They actually could predict what books were selling, and then they would order them. You always had them in the store rather than going into a store and saying, do you have this book? No, we'll have to order it. It'd be 2 weeks. That was Borders' leap, was their technology. Okay, so technology, again, is a common theme. Self-publishing was one of the things that happened next. It became easy for people to self-publish. There's always been self-publishing. It was called vanity press earlier on. But now Amazon makes it incredibly simple for people to self-publish. That pulled some books out of the bookstore, frankly, especially among authors who had a following, who could do their own and bring their audience with them. Many authors started doing that. And one of the reasons they did that is, say you publish a paperback book with a regular publisher, you might get 48 cents for that book as the author. Well, you're going to get nearly the whole deal if you self-publish. You're going to pay a premium to like Amazon or whoever's self-publishing it for you, but you're going to make more than $5 probably on the same book that you made 48 cents for. So for a lot of people, that just became economics. It was a simple thing to do. The other thing that happened right about the same time again was in 1998, Google decided, because they are worth billions, they could digitize virtually any book in a library, and they could do that. They were able to digitize books in Stanford's, Harvard's, University of Michigan's, New York Public Library. They digitized every book in every collection in those libraries. Now they've moved to Europe, and they're digitizing the European libraries. So all of a sudden, there is millions of books, 14 million books online that you can have access for free, basically. Probably they're going to digitize 25 million books they'll have by the end of the year. But in the context of how many books there are really in the world, there's probably 130 million books that are significant enough to digitize. So they've got a long way to go. But again, that started to disintegrate the access for a place like this rare book room, where the only place you could see that book was in a library. And you sometimes couldn't see it unless you were a scholar. You had no access to it, ever. So, I mean, this just opened the whole gateway. Printing on demand happened about the same time, too. So I could go into a place, there's maybe 5 or 6 of those, bring my manuscript, if it was properly formatted, and have it printed on site. It would cost me $10 to $15. But probably the most technological influence on book publishing was the e-reader. The e-reader really has a history that dates back into the 1940s. However, the difference happened in 2009, September, when Amazon introduced what is called the Kindle. That was the first introduction of it. It was followed very closely by the Nook, which was Barnes & Noble's proprietary device, and then by the Apple iPod in January 2010. But the Kindle has really led to a revolution in how people read. Initially, everybody said that it wouldn't work. People want to read a physical book. Unfortunately, for a lot of things, that wasn't the case. That's just not reality. By July 2010, approximately, Amazon had already reported sales of its e-books were outnumbering sales of its hardcovers. 1 year later, e-books outnumbered the sales of its paperbacks. So, I mean, that happened in, 1.5 years at the most? And for the first time ever, they were selling more books as a whole on ebook than they were on hardcover, and that was in 2010 also. That was dramatic. They were selling about 140 ebooks to 100 physical books. In the world we live in, that was virtually overnight. I mean, it just happened that quickly. And it left people scrambling. It left publishers scrambling because the prices were half the price of a third of a price in some instances of a regular book. It sort of destroyed the whole industry from the standpoint of tradition. There was no more tradition in the industry left. In fact, today, I believe it's today, that Amazon announces the new Kindle, the HD edition, which starts at $199. And Google will be very quickly after that with their new reader. I think it's called the Nexus. But the new Kindle, you can get Wi-Fi for it for $49 a year. Now that's an introductory. I know they're not going to hold that forever, but that's compared to typically $25 a month. I mean, they are trying to do everything. They are not going about it easily. They're going to just do everything they can to rub it in. It's going to be an interesting year going forward. There's a convenience in e-readers for a lot of people. It can hold an entire library, I mean thousands of books. You can travel with it. In fact, you never see anybody reading a book on a plane anymore. It's an e-reader. Its size is comfortable. The screens have gotten very good. You can read on a beach, sunny in sun. The other thing that I think they didn't realize is a lot of older people buy it because you can adjust the size. You do not have to buy a large type book anymore. It's instantaneous on a download, so if I want a book, I have it in literally seconds. I mean, you can say seconds. It's that fast. The price, it is about $9.99 typically. In fact, they just announced today, Kindle, and probably in conjunction with this release, that Michael Chabon's new book is $9.99. So I mean, that's as low as you can go. The hardback, it's going to be $27 or $28. So all these things came about within, 3-4 years of what was the introduction of the Kindle. Right now, a new study from the Pew Foundation showed that 29% of Americans own an e-reader. That is massive. I don't know if we could say that even the telephone happened that fast, or cell phones. The most recent bestseller, which is 50 Shades, 50 Shades, 50 Shades, was in conjunction with the privacy you get from an e-reader. About half its sales are from the e-reader, if not more, and that's 50 million books. They're selling for $14.99. They haven't discounted that yet. But for people that don't know, 50 Shades is about a S&M relationship. There are 3 books in a series, and then a collection of it. Well, those 4 books are in the top 20 of all the books sold. They're selling 1 out of 3 books sold in this country right now has something to do with 50 Shades. It's just not. It just makes no sense. That's all I can say. It's an incredible pop culture phenomena that doesn't seem to go away. These books have been on the bestsellers list for 26 weeks. I would think everyone owns one by now. What else is interesting is they outsell the next book by, how about 100 to 1. There's nobody even close to this. There's just nothing. In fact, it's brought other similar books up into its arena. They're starting to make the bestsellers list that have nothing to do with 50 Shades. I think it just is an example of how powerful a tool e-readers can be. And it's pushed the industry, obviously. They're doing more, this softer, well, it's not really soft pornography. It's pretty hardcore. So they're doing more of that because they know they can sell them. The other thing I think that everybody would understand is what I call Napsterization of the publishing industry. You can pretty much get any book for free online if you want to be a pirate. You can read it, you can download it and read it for free. So I mean, that's taking some percentages off. I mean, what if it's even 3 and 4%? It's happening. Also simultaneously, we talked about the publishing industry really disintegrating from a business model it really had kept for 100 years. And the other thing that happened was the newspaper industry fell apart about the same time. Now, how that tied in was that's how books got promoted, was in reviewers' space in newspapers. There are only a handful of newspapers now that carry book reviews. Book reviews have mostly gone to what the industry would call amateurs like myself who do blogs. That's what makes a book sell now, is a blog. And there are hundreds and hundreds of very good bloggers. And there's also hundreds and hundreds of very poor bloggers who for 10 cents will make your book sound good. One of the things that people forget too in the book industry that really kind of helped the book industry keep going was the celebrity book club, Oprah. Oprah started in 1995. The book industry loved when Oprah announced a new book. I mean, they would sell tens of millions or a million of these books. She kept that going for 15 years and then stopped it for a couple of years. But she's back with Oprah 2.0. But she also is promoting ebooks. I mean, she is not doing this exclusive hardcover, hold it in your hand book. Another thing that happened in books that kind of led to some, again, small decline in American booksellers, American authors, was the globalization of authors. We are reading now in this country many, many more authors who originate in another country. Everything from mysteries. Now we're reading translated mysteries routinely. We're reading some of the best fiction that's been written by authors who originate in another country. And that's added to this whole decline in the American industry. The other thing I'd like to comment on briefly, because we're sitting in an archive, is digitization of the industry. And that means, like, say, authors. Very few authors write longhand anymore. And even the best of authors are being pushed into write, or at least have it transcribed on a computer. Now what that typically means is, because we're sitting in an archives, is you used to be able to go in an archives and look at an author's collection of papers and see from the day they originated the idea with a sort of note on literally sometimes a napkin all the way through to the finished product. You're not going to see that anymore. All this is done on computer. There's no handwritten marks anywhere, or seldom, and I don't think people are saving. They're just not doing it like they used to do that. So the archives are going to look different. We're going to know a lot less about our authors. And also we're going to know a lot less about what they were thinking, because unless they're saving and archiving their email, because letters are another important thing to learn, to kind of peek into an author's life. We are in a generation that we're the last to see those. The next generation, you're not going to get quite the same kind of collections out of emails. People are just not saving them in the same way. Plus you can't match up the email with someone else's email. It's going to be an interesting, that's a loss, I think, to people. Now, a lot of it will be picked up. I'm not saying what I'm talking about is bad, because I don't think you can say it's bad or good. It is what it is. And I think the industry has come around to accept it. I mean, they're starting to do things with books that they didn't do. Like they're extending the book by adding graphic packages, videos to them. They're getting a lot smarter on how they put out a book, and they're making them, for example, I have On the Road on my iPad because it gives interviews with the characters in On the Road. It gives me an interactive map. I mean, if you don't know who Ginsberg is, and a lot of people who are reading it have no clue anymore, you can find out who he was and how he pertained to that book. So, I mean, those kinds of things are incredibly valuable. You would have to go, you wouldn't have been able to get those anymore. I mean, you'll be able to read James Joyce annotated now, which it's hard even to read annotated, but before you couldn't do that as easily. You will be able to do that, just touch the screen and it'll come up and explain to you really what's being said in one of his odd sentence structures. Another thing that's happened in the industry that I don't think anybody expected is kind of the move toward dystopian literature, especially for juveniles, like the Hunger Games. It's a huge phenomenon going on. It doesn't seem to end. About the same time, vampires and zombies came along. I don't think that's ending anytime soon. Graphic novels is another thing that's a big trend in the industry. They're fun to read. They're making graphic novels out of a lot of different literature, and they're really interesting. And they're expensive. They're not cheap. They cost sometimes more than books. So, I mean, you're not thinking they're comic books at all. They're expensive books. and they're doing very well. That's just some of the... Now, could I make a prediction? I'm not sure where we're going to go next. I know ebooks is going to be the dominant form. I think one of the things that will happen, though, I think the next big slice for the ebook industry is textbooks. And it's not going as fast as I thought it would. It seems that students like to write in their books and do yellow underlining in them. But for $200 a textbook, which you might be able to get for $20, textbooks will come. They'll be the next big change, and I'm going to be speaking to a couple classes in the next week. I'm going to be anxious to see if they are doing that. I mean, students were one of the first people to make Amazon work. They found they could buy a used textbook on there for a tenth of the price sometimes, and did it quickly. One of the things that Amazon introduced is sort of the classic short story or classic nonfiction long magazine article, and it's called the Amazon Single. It has been very successful. It can cost 99 cents, $2.99, but if you can get your selection sort of highlighted on Amazon, you're going to sell thousands of those copies. It's sort of a new way to look at a short story, too, because a lot of authors are doing that. A lot of Michael Connelly, who's a very famous mystery author, has put short stories as Amazon singles. If they sell 100,000 of them, they get $100,000. This, I mean, roughly, that's a pretty good deal. They have learned these lessons very quickly, and there's a lot of good things on Amazon singles. Magazines, when we had them, they're the next thing that are sort of disappearing from the face of the earth. You could spend, what, $6 for a magazine to read one article. Well, you might be able to download that for $99 or $2.99 now, and very likely could. The other thing that I've noticed on Amazon Signals is, say somebody wrote a lot of magazine articles 40 years ago. I mean, they were the cutting edge articles about, say, rock and roll. They are putting those up as Amazon Signals. They own those, and for the first time, they're able to sell off what they wrote 40 years ago. That's pretty powerful, a freeing democratization of the whole world that we live in. They would have never. They might have got one of those stories in a collection on rock and roll from 1960. They're able to offer those books themselves, put that money in their pocket. For a lot of people, this is a sea change that was hard, because everybody thought to be successful, you had to have a hardcover book. I mean, that's when you sort of arrived as an author, as you had a hardcover. It's growing less and less important every day, because people realize that the bottom line is, can I make a living as an author? And if I do it myself and I make a living, is that not better than having one hardcover book that only sells 2,000 copies and the rest are remaindered? I think it is, and a lot of people are learning that. It's a big sea change, though, because there's that ego built into seeing that hardcover book when you walk into a Barnes & Noble on a table. I'm not sure what's going to do to collecting of books. First, there's fewer books, by far. I mean, you can notice. It's noticeable in the used book industry. You go try and find a hardcover copy of a James Patterson book, which used to be everywhere. You can build houses out of them. They're gone. They don't exist anymore. They're just not around. You can notice it if you go into used bookstores. It's very hard to get the popular books anymore in the paperback or hardback. One of the things I've been able to do, because I've interviewed so many authors, is I of course have my favorites, and I become friends with many of them. And we communicate a lot, both in person and by email, typically. One of the things I noted about some of these authors in email is they write as well in email as they do in a finished book. I'm just amazed. I mean, you can tell a genius when they write. It doesn't matter what they write it in. It's just amazing. It's scary. But people like Jim Harrison, who's an MSU graduate, has written now probably 40 books. He was from Reed City originally, and then he grew up in Hazlet, Michigan, which hardly anyone around here in Lansing recognizes. It's amazing to me. People are reading him in France, and I'm thinking, he grew up in Hazlet, Michigan. He sells more books in France than he does here. He's an unusual writer. He's always been his own person. He's got an incredible character called Brown Dog in many of his novellas that is half Indian, half white, who has not the highest moral standards. Another author is a good friend of Jim's, is Tom Mcguane, who went to MSU. He was on, he wrote poetry while he was at MSU. He's had a legendary career. He's written probably not as many books as Jim, maybe 20. Richard Ford, he's written only a third of any of their books, but he's written a Pulitzer Prize winner called Independence Day. He went to school at MSU. He taught at U of M. He taught high school in Flint for a while. Well, I'm working on children's books, and we've got 3 or 4 of them going, a friend and I, Greg Parker, who works in Ann Arbor for the University of Michigan. And we let him lie a while. We have them written, and Greg had some children. He's younger than I am, and now he's back wanting to work on them. And so the one we're really getting anxious to get moving on and are moving on is a story about Taffy Abel, who is a Michigan Indian from Sault Ste. Marie who was on the 1925 American Olympic hockey team. He was also the first American Indian ever to play in the NHL. He played on 2 teams and won Stanley Cups in both those teams. And what we want to do with this book is tell his story as a young man growing up in Sault Ste. Marie, extremely poor, in poverty, and his leap to fame. But we also want to do it in 2 languages. We want to do it in the original language of the Ojibwa and in English.